Week 3 is officially upon us, and there's a lot to unpack at the wide receiver position, specifically when it comes to your start-sit decisions. So today, I'll be going through my top 30 wide receivers in a tier list format and help you make those decisions. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're on the road to 40,000 subscribers as always. Appreciate you guys for that continued support. With that being said, let's waste no more time and let's get right into it. All right, before I get into the official top 30, I want to go through my will they play tier of guys, basically going through, the practice reports, seeing if these guys will eventually suit up on Sunday. So Brandon Ayuk was technically listed in here. We obviously know, if you guys watch Thursday Night Football, was inactive in that game against the New York Giants. So if you had Brandon Ayuk, hopefully you did not leave him in your lineup because he was inactive. Amon-Ra St. Brown is the next guy listed here. He's dealing with turf toe from last week's game, and he practiced on Thursday. He should be set to go, but these things do linger, so I am a little bit concerned about the toe. However, if he does suit up, if he's ready to go for Sunday, he is a clear-cut top 10 wide receiver in my rankings. Jalen Waddle, he suffered a concussion in last week's game against the New England Patriots, and he didn't practice on Thursday. His game time status, and I do think it's something to monitor. If he doesn't land a practice on Friday or Saturday, I have severe pessimism in terms of Jalen Waddle actually suiting up for Sunday's game. You got to be prepared to sit him. If you have him on your team, be prepared to have another option to put in your lineup. However, if he does play, if he does suit up for this Sunday, he will be a top 15 wide receiver in my rankings. Amari Cooper, wide receiver of the Cleveland Browns, returned to practice Thursday with the groin injury that hindered him all week, including that Monday Night Football game against the Steelers. He should be ready to go. I would really be shocked if he sat in this game, and he's going to be a wide receiver 2 in my rankings, assuming he plays. DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks. He didn't practice Thursday with the rib issue, and like I said with Waddle, if he doesn't get a practice in on Friday or Saturday, I do have severe concerns in regards to his ability to play on Sunday. He is a wide receiver 2 for me if he does play, however, so if you do have him, he does play. He's got wide receiver 2 level confidence. And then finally, Christian Watson, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers. He practiced on Wednesday, and people were questioning, he didn't practice on Thursday. Is he hurt again? Like, what's going on here? But according to the Packers, they just gave him a designated rest day. He should be fully ready to go, ready to make his season opener, his season debut in week 3 this upcoming week. Obviously been dealing with that hamstring injury in the first 2 weeks, but if Christian Watson plays, plug him in as a top 25 level option. But now we go on to the wide receivers 1 to 6. And like always, I'm only going to go through a few names of the top 6 and the top 12 respectively. But first name of the top 6 I want to talk about is CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, plays on the road to play the Arizona Cardinals. He's my wide receiver 2 this week, and he's coming off a big-time performance against that New York Jets secondary, a very, very tough unit with guys like Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed on the outside there at cornerback for the Jets, and he was able to carve them up for 11 receptions, 143 yards, and an absolute monster performance. He's going up now against the Cardinals secondary that is completely night and day to the one he played last week, and the Cowboys are implied for the second most points of every team this week. In my opinion, if Lamb keeps playing the way he showed this past Sunday, he's got to be a locked-in top 5 or 6 wide receiver every single week moving forward. And given the fortune of the matchup going up against Arizona, Marco Wilson, a really struggling secondary on the other side, I think CeeDee Lamb is poised for a monster week. Tyreek Hill, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, going up against the Denver Broncos at home this week. He's my wide receiver 3. And again, if you want to argue him being as wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 1, I'm fine with it because he's that level of talent. This offense is that good. The only concern I do have is that, in my opinion, Pat Surtain is the best cornerback in the NFL. Hill's too good to rank outside of the top 3. I mean, he's pretty clearly the 1A or the 1B in terms of best wide receiver in the NFL with Justin Jefferson. So I can't drop him lower than this despite the tough matchup. I mean, Miami is still implied for too many points for him to go lower than my wide receiver 3 in my rankings. If you have him on your team, expect the same old Tyreek Hill. There's not really much else to say. This guy's a freak of nature. And the third wide receiver I want to talk about from this range is Jamar Chase, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. So the Bengals offense bounced back in a big way in the second half of that game against the Baltimore Ravens last week. And while Chase had a relatively pedestrian day overall, T. Higgins is the one who saw the eruption. 8 receptions, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns in this past week's game. The Bengals are 0-2 right now. There's an upcoming tough matchup against the Rams team that's really, really surprised to start this season. They cannot afford falling to 0-3. I think Burrow's going to be active, and if he is, Chase has an ultimate get-right spot against a defense that ranks as the 4th easiest matchup on the matchup chart. But moving on to wide receiver 7 to 12, the first one I want to talk about is Keenan Allen, wide receiver of the Los Angeles Chargers. Going up on the road to play the Minnesota Vikings this week. He's my wide receiver 8 overall. He's gotten off to a scorching start to the season. Obviously, in the first couple games, he's looked absolutely dynamite. This Chargers offense looked really, really good. Fourth graded offense in terms of EPA per play, and they're facing off against a defense right now with Minnesota that cannot stop a nosebleed. There's a 54.5 over-under in this game. The Chargers are implied for 26.5 points, and this game environment is absolutely scorching for fantasy football. He receives a bump from where I usually would rank him. He would usually be, a top 12, top 15-ish level option, but given the fact he's playing Minnesota this week in that game environment, he's a top 8 wide receiver in my rankings. Devontae Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, going on the road on Monday Night Football to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's proven he's a wide receiver 1 level talent, and on the Eagles, I think it's more of a 1A, 1B situation with him and A.J. Brown rather than a clear-cut A.J. Brown's the 1, Devontae Smith's the 2. Because if you look since week 2 of last year, they've been virtually identical from a fantasy perspective. They're averaging the same amount of points per game. You see the tweet here from JJ Zachariason, 16.4 regular season PPR points per game. And in that stretch, A.J. Brown has only out-targeted Devontae Smith by 1. So realistically, if you wanted to say that you had Devontae Smith ranked higher than A.J. Brown or A.J. Brown ranked higher than Devontae Smith, it shouldn't cause any concern for anybody because Devontae Smith has earned that level of standing. I think he's a legit top 10 level real life wide receiver. And realistically, the talent level between him and A.J. Brown is very, very close. The final wide receiver in this tier I want to talk about is Puka Nacua, wide receiver of the Los Angeles Rams, going on the road to play the Cincinnati Bengals this week. He's currently ranked as my wide receiver 13, but like I said with Devontae Smith, if Amon-Ra St. Brown is ruled out for his matchup, he will be the wide receiver 12 in my rankings. And guys, I'm not denying Puka Nacua at this point anymore. The guy gets open. He gets fed targets. He's in the perfect system for his skill set with Sean McVay in that Rams offense. I mean, he leads the NFL in targets in his first 2 career NFL games. Whatever I thought about him coming into the pre-draft process is really moot now. He's a good player. He earns targets. He earns volume on what could be a potential top 15 level offense with the Los Angeles Rams, the way McVay's calling it and the way Matthew Stafford's playing. Obviously, it's a tough matchup against this Bengals defense on Monday Night Football, but his role right now in that McVay offense is completely matchup proof in my opinion. But you guys need to start these guys. You need to start the top 12 wide receivers in my rankings. If you have them, they were always going to enter your lineup. Now we get into the meat and potatoes of the video, and that's going to be my wide receivers 13 to 30. And starting it off, I have my high-end wide receiver 2s kicked off by T. Higgins as my wide receiver 13. Like mentioned with Jamar Chase playing that Los Angeles Rams defense on Monday night. And he erased any doubt after a bad week 1 performance. He had that goose egg in week 1 on 8 targets. We talked about the fact that was not going to be sustainable, and it proved to be not sustainable. 8 receptions, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns in that week 2 game. He's commanded 20 targets in the first 2 games for the Bengals. And if the Bengals offense figures it out, it's the same exact argument for Devontae Smith. Only I think there's more volume in this Bengals offense comparatively to what I see in the Eagles. Bengals, obviously, like I said, with Chase, must-win environment. I think they rely heavily on their big dogs to go secure the win. So Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, they have to be the main factors in a big-time Bengals win this week if they want to get back on track, which I think they will. Wide receiver 14 would have been Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. You guys would have already saw he played on Thursday Night Football. 25.1 PPR points. If you started Deebo Samuel, you were more than happy with that level of performance with the absence of Brandon Ayuk in the 49ers lineup. Wide receiver 15 for me is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going to play the Philadelphia Eagles this week. He's currently a top 5 overall wide receiver in fantasy to start the year. And while I can't rank him up in the wide receiver 1 area, I do think he deserves to be a consistent wide receiver 2 option, given the amount of upside he presents on a weekly basis. And the reason being, too, this week is that the Eagles' pass defense has been relatively disappointing to start the year. We saw what they were able to do last year. Pass rush was getting after it. Secondary was playing lockdown. But unfortunately, for the first part of this year, the Eagles defense hasn't looked quite the same, maybe missing the loss of Jonathan Gannon as their main play caller. And under Dave Canales, this Bucs offense has looked really good, looked really efficient. Baker looks the most comfortable he has since his Cleveland Browns days. And I trust the Buccaneers to be able to put up points at a high rate. And what I expect to be a sneaky high-scoring game. The Bucs offense is better than people think. The Eagles defense is worse than people think. And I do think the Bucs will be able to move the ball and score points against the Philadelphia Eagles on Monday. Wide receiver 16 is Mike Williams of the Los Angeles Chargers. Goes on the road to play the Minnesota Vikings, like I mentioned with Keenan Allen. And this game environment, like I said, is completely bonkers. High over-under at 54.5. Sharps are hammering the over in this game. There's going to be a ton of points scored. I wouldn't be shocked if it was like a 38-35 level game going either way. Both teams are desperate. Both teams are 0-2. Both offenses are the carries of this team, and I expect to see fireworks come Sunday for this matchup. Wide receiver 17 is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets going to play the New England Patriots. And it's a very similar bet to the one I made last week. Obviously, the tough matchup for Garrett Wilson going up against the Dallas Cowboys. But in my opinion, he's a good enough player, top 10 level talent in real life to be able to just win the matchup on his own right. And the fact that he was able to produce last week against the Cowboys, as good as the Patriots defense is, they are not the Dallas Cowboys defense. I expect Garrett Wilson to produce at least a wide receiver 2 level. But given his talent level, he can absolutely explode at any given moment. Wide receiver 18 is Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, going to play the Baltimore Ravens on the road this week. He's been a sneaky big winner for fantasy this year. His quarterback situation has looked far more settled to start the year than anybody could have possibly imagined. And even without Anthony Richardson in the lineup, I'm confident Gardner Minshew is going to be able to distribute the ball. In terms of pace of play as well, been a very high-paced offense to start the year. And Pittman's been the main beneficiary out of it. 24 targets in the first 2 games. There's no reason not to regard him as a wide receiver 2 in fantasy if this is the level of involvement we can expect on a week-to-week basis. But shifting off of Michael Pittman Jr., we head on to the low-end wide receiver 2s. And starting off with Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. He bounced back in week 2 after a bad week 1. And DK is possibly out this week, like I mentioned, with that rib issue. Geno Smith and the offense look back to normal after a bad week 1, and I expect them to keep that momentum up in a game environment where they're implied for 24 points this week against Carolina. Nico Collins, wide receiver of the Houston Texans, goes up on the road to play the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, and he comes in as my wide receiver 20. He's one of the biggest surprises at the wide receiver position to start this year, and he's looked like a straight up number 1 caliber wide receiver. 20 targets, over 220 receiving yards in the first 2 games this year. And wide receiver 2 range may even feel low, all things considered. Like, I think there's a real possibility as the clear-cut alpha on a surprising Texans offense, he could potentially be a mid-range wide receiver 2 moving forward. I thought he could potentially fight for top 30, top 24 status coming into the year, but he's way overperformed my expectations. Again, like I said, if he continues what he's doing, man, he's got a legitimate top 15, top 16 level profile when it comes to Nico Collins. Wide receiver 21 is Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, plays against the Philadelphia Eagles, like I mentioned with Evans. And right now to start the year, Evans has been the true wide receiver 1 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but Chris Godwin has historically held the more productive role compared to him versus Mike Evans. And while right now I would still rank Evans over Godwin, given what we've seen to start this year, Godwin has the easier matchups of the duo, having to play from the slot rather than on the outside against a guy like Darius Slay, like Mike Evans has to. He's been a consistent chain mover to start the year, but I want to see Godwin get back to that big playability he's been accustomed to, especially in that 2019 season where he was the wide receiver 2 overall. Going on forward, we go to my wide receiver 22 and my official start of the week, Jordan Addison, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings, going up against the Chargers, like I mentioned numerous times on today's video. But this game total is obviously very, very high. Like I said, high implied over-under, high implied points for the Minnesota Vikings. They need to get out of that 0-2 hole. The one way they're going to be able to do it is pushing the ball down the field on offense, because that's been their main bread and butter. They can't run the ball. They can't stop a nosebleed on defense. They have to rely upon Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson to keep the ball moving on offense. And I think they do this week. If Jordan Addison is able to see a slight uptick in snaps in particular, I think he could be considered as a fringe top 20-ish level wide receiver moving forward. So I want to get ahead of the curve. He's my wide receiver 22 this week. I think he's in for a monster outing against the Chargers. Wide receiver 23 is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, going up against the Indianapolis Colts. He's been extremely impressive through his first 2 career starts, just like Jordan Addison. He currently leads the Ravens in targets and receiving yards, and they're making a concerted effort to get him the ball in space. And against Indy, a secondary that's been torched each of the first 2 games of the year, where the Ravens are applied for over 26 points this week, I expect Zay to continue this monster pace. But wide receiver 24 is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, goes on the road to play the Las Vegas Raiders. And in his first game without Deontay Johnson on the field this year, we saw George Pickens take true strides to developing into a true number 1 wide receiver. He commanded 10 targets and saw a much more expanded route tree this week than what we've ever seen from George Pickens. We know George Pickens over the course of his rookie year was this big boundary wide receiver, go balls, deep balls. That was his role in the offense. But in week 2, we saw him used across the formation, across all portions of the field, treated as a true number 1 wide receiver by this offense. And I'm always willing to bet on young players who take a promising step up like George Pickens did. If this role is legit, if he can keep expanding on this role that we saw in week 2, I'll have no choice but to rank him as a wide receiver 2 moving forward. He's got the talent level. If he expands that route tree and is able to win on all 3 levels of the field, I have no issues raising George Pickens in my rest of season rankings. Moving on to the wide receiver 3s, we start with DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, going on the road to play the Kansas City Chiefs. He's been the only bright spot on what's been an extremely disappointing Bears offense. And after only commanding 2 targets in week 1, we saw DJ Moore command 7 targets on the 29 Justin Fields pass attempts for a 6 for 104 line in week 2. I expect DJ Moore to be the focal point of this passing offense moving forward. A passing offense that's been much higher volume than anticipated coming into the year, with Moore operating as that wide receiver 1 for the team. And if the offense turns around in terms of its efficiency and can become closer to a below average unit rather than the worst in the entire NFL, I think Moore has a chance to rise in my rankings. But for now, given how bad the offense looks, he has to be relegated to wide receiver 3 territory. Wide receiver 26, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans, goes on the road to play the Cleveland Browns this week. He is the clear-cut number 1 alpha wide receiver for this team, but the problem with him this week is that the matchup is brutal and the game environment is an absolute mess. What the Browns defense has shown me in the first 2 weeks is that they're a legit elite unit, and Martin Emerson and Denzel Ward has been one of the top cornerback duos in the entire NFL this year. The Titans are only implied for 18 points in this game. The Browns are the second toughest matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers. And while D-Hop, I think, will still get the volume, I have severe question marks when it comes to the efficiency on that volume and when it comes to the overall opportunity for the offense to score points this week. Wide receiver 27, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, goes on the road to play the Detroit Lions in this week's game. And he bounced back in a big way in week 2. Obviously, week 1, that dreadful performance puts up a goose egg. Only 1 target. In week 2, we do see him involved heavily in this offense back again. Scores a touchdown, has about 70 yards in the game, looked a lot better in week 2. And this is a guy that typically demands targets at a high rate. We saw last year in his rookie season commanded over a 29% target share as a rookie. I expect him to carry, 7 plus, 8 plus targets per game moving forward, rather than that anomaly we saw in week 1. And in an advantageous matchup against what's been a bad Lions secondary thus far, I expect him to continue where he left off last week. Wide receiver 28, Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos, goes on the road to play the Miami Dolphins. He returned in week 2. Obviously, the pedestrian stat line, 3 catches, 25 yards, didn't really play too well in terms of his overall production, but he only played on 68% of the Broncos snaps. And I expect him to be much more involved in the Broncos game plan. Second week coming back, obviously dealt with that injury in the preseason, did not play in week 1. I expect him to be at full capacity entering week 3. Russell Wilson's looked very, very improved to start the season, has looked genuinely good, played some genuinely good football. And the Broncos offense had an encouraging performance against Washington. Yes, they lost the game, but they scored 33 points. They took a 21-3 lead. The offense did as much as it could, but the defense let them down in that game. And I expect Jeudy to bounce back with his normal snap share in the second highest over-under of the entire slate, with the Denver Broncos going up against the Miami Dolphins. Wide receiver number 29 is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, goes to play the Houston Texans at home this week. And the Jaguars are implied for 26.5 points this week, and Kirk saw that usual high involvement this past week after the dud that he had in week 1. 14 targets, 11 receptions. Looked like that same wide receiver that passed the 1,000-yard figure this past year. And while I don't expect him to see 14 targets every single week, I do think he showed that he can earn valuable targets on what I project to be a top 10 offense with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then finally, rounding out this list, we have my wide receiver 30, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, going to play the Buffalo Bills at home this week. Washington's been one of the more surprising offenses in the entire NFL. Sam Howell's thrown 70 passes in the first 2 games. And while the targets so far have been pretty widespread, I trust that over the course of the year, McLaurin and Jahan Dotson are going to separate themselves from the pack. It's a tough test against the Bills. Obviously, Trey White, that secondary, has been playing very good to start the season. But I expect Terry McLaurin to carry that momentum he showed last week. Scored a touchdown, looked good. This Washington offense looks good, and I'm willing to bet on it. But finally, we wrap up with my 5 deeper league plays. The guys that are outside of my top 40 or so rankings that I expect to have a big game this week. Elijah Moore, wide receiver of the Cleveland Browns. He's gotten great usage. He's run over 80% of the team routes to start the year. And while the fantasy points haven't been there, I think a big spike week is coming. We just need Deshaun Watson to play a little bit better. We just need some of those targets to result in catches. And I think Elijah Moore will have a big week soon enough. Wide receiver Brandon Cooks of my Dallas Cowboys goes to play the Arizona Cardinals. Talked about how advantageous the matchup was when I talked about CeeDee Lamb, but that also applies to Brandon Cooks. Obviously missed week 2, dealt with that knee injury, but he's been a full participant in practice. It looks like he's ready to go, ready to play in this week 3 game, and he's got the opportunity to leave his stamp on this Dallas offense and be that deep threat that they traded for him to be this offseason. Wide receiver Sky Moore of the Kansas City Chiefs goes up against Chicago Bears, and if you started this guy in week 1, obviously you got burned in a big way with that 0.4 point total that he produced. But if you started him in week 2, did catch that big touchdown, had 70 yards, has been running the most routes on Kansas City. And like we know in this game, the Kansas City Chiefs are implied for the most points on the entire slate at 30 points against the Chicago Bears defense that cannot stop a nosebleed. So I expect Sky Moore to be a big-time contributor against this struggling Bears defense. Wide receiver Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers goes up against the New Orleans Saints. And yes, Christian Watson will be back, but I think Jayden Reed has pretty much established himself as that number 2 weapon on this team thus far. He looks good. He's got that slot role on lockdown, and it looks like Jordan Love has already built a level of trust with Jayden Reed. So even if Christian Watson plays, I do think there's enough pie available for Jayden Reed to be able to produce, especially with him operating out of that slot role, like I said. And then finally, wrapping it up, we have Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers at home this week. Had a big time week 1, missed week 2 with a concussion, is set to come back to gameplay this week. Obviously, we know that Devontae Adams is going to be clear-cut number 1 for the Raiders. I do think at this point, Jacoby Myers has to be considered the team's clear-cut wide receiver too. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Like I said at the beginning of the video, leave your biggest start-sit questions in the comment section down below. And of course, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 40,000 subscribers. Also note, if you guys want full access to mine and Corey's rankings on a week-to-week basis, talking about our rest of season rankings and our weekly rankings, there is one of 2 ways to access those right now. The first way, if you guys go on to Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FSE, you will get 100% match back on your deposit up to $100. And of course, free access to both our rest of season and weekly rankings. So please do not miss out on that opportunity. You guys just have to put in $10+ and you guys will be able to get access to our rankings. And the other way to be able to access them is going over to flockfantasy.com using promo code FSE for 30% off your Flocker or your Mother Flocker packages. And from there, you will also have access to our rankings every single week. But with that being said, peace out. Good luck in your week 3 matchups.